So welcome to the Marx Memorial Library. My name's Tom Hodgkinson. I'm editor of the Idler magazine. It's a magazine I started in 1993 with a friend of mine called Gav. And the reason for me starting it was that I had a job at the Sunday Mirror magazine in Fleet Street, and which I got kind of by chance. And I really hated this job, and I'd had a wonderful time at school, I'd had a wonderful time at university, I'd really enjoyed the sort of freedom and time we had to do projects that we wanted to do, me and my friends, for their own sake, voluntarily, you know, not to make money, playing in bands. I wasn't playing the ukulele then, but you know, running magazines, putting on nightclub nights, whatever it might be, and also having acres of leisure time to sit in the cafe and read and listen to music and talk to my friends. And, you know, the academic life also I loved because you could work in your own time. And my time was my own in the sense that I could control when I worked. I wasn't doing any work. And I'd really enjoyed that. But so I was in London, I was sort of 23, 24. And I'd had a job actually for a year working at a skateboarding shop and a record shop called Rough Trade Records, which had been been great fun, even though it was like a full-time job. I enjoyed meeting the customers and made lots of new friends in the skateboarding and music world. So here I was stuck, actually just around the corner from here in Holborn Square, when the Daily Mirror was still in Fleet Street, and hating my job. And by mistake, I came across a collection of writings by Dr. Johnson. So Dr. Johnson, again, who lived around the corner from here, who wrote the first English dictionary in the 1760s, I think. He was a wonderful writer. He wrote plays and poems, an early novel. He wrote loads of essays for the new Grub Street, the emerging breed of new magazines that were starting then. You know, The Spectator, The Tatler had started earlier in the 18th century. And he wrote for a magazine called The Gentleman's Magazine, which is actually just around the corner from here in St. John's Gate. And he also wrote diaries and these little sort of resolutions that he would write to himself on important occasions like his birthday or Easter. How I'm going to improve my life next year. Next year I'm going to get up early, he said. Because I often lie in bed until 12 or even 2. I'm going to resolve to get up at 8, and even if I only get up at 10, that's still 2 hours earlier than I often stay in bed, because I often lie in bed till 2. So, and then when his friends, you know, the young rakes of London town, like Boswell, when he was older, went to visit him, he would never be working. He would either be in bed reading, or dozing, or sort of meditating, or whatever. Or he'd been engaged in chemistry experiments, which is a way of sort of distracting himself from his work. Well, I had one day at home in my flat in Portobello Road while I was working at the Sunday Mirror, and that was the day when I was like, OK, I'm going to get on with my own work. But it didn't tend to go that well. I would be unable to get out of bed. There was no one to make me get out of bed. And once out of bed, I'd have a bath and find it very difficult to get out of the bath, and then have lunch, probably have a nap. And then I had a Game Boy. Do you remember the Tetris Game Boys? And then I'd still have a quick 5 minutes on this before I get down to some work. And then 2.5 hours later, I'd sort of throw it aside in a kind of sort of fit of self-recrimination. And so Dr. Johnson's self-recrimination really appealed to me, and also the fact that he worked very, very quickly. So how did he get his work done? Well, he did it very, very fast on the deadline. So the printer's boy would run up to his room, waiting for his column. You know, he was writing columns for the weekly newspapers, and take each sheet of manuscript from under his pen as he was finishing it. He didn't even have time to read over it or correct it. And the boy would run down with this one sheet, give it to the typesetters who started laying out the type, and then run back for his second sheet, and then run back, and everything would be done just in time. And then Dr. Johnson would sort of collapse and then go to the tavern. I thought that's a nice way of working. That's much better than getting up early in the morning and doing a sort of a 9 to 5 or a 10 to 6 for a group of people who I really hate, and I feel sort of vaguely humiliated by, and probably a bit big-headed. You know, I was sort of 24, 25, and I felt I was sort of superior to these people who were above me, who were telling me what to do. It was actually quite a good experience journalistically when I later started the magazine. So The Idler came from me reading Dr. Johnson's essays called The Idler, which was published for about 2 years in the Gentleman's Magazine, and talked about his own idleness. And he said things like, every man is or hopes to be an idler, because just as peace is the purpose of war, you know, you're hoping for peace at the end of the war and the battle, idleness is what you're looking for at the end of your toil and work. And he also talked about his way of working, which was a bit like the principle of momentum. So you know, the longer you're pushing a heavy ball up the hill, the quicker it falls down the other side. So he knew that this time that he spent lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, apparently, you know, doing nothing, was actually the time when he was most deeply plunged into his work. It's just that he wasn't actually putting it pen to paper. So this made me realise, you know, idleness is, you know, it's a good thing. We've all been brought up to work very hard, and this Protestant work ethic, as it's called, comes from all sides. We don't even know where it comes from because it's so sort of ingrained. But is it actually natural? Is it actually natural to work hard? Well, my argument, and the argument I'm going to lay out in this short piece lecture now, is that no, it's not at all natural. And I'm going to prove that by showing that societies in the past have actually praised idleness as a very important part of life. And different societies at different times have either praised idleness more or less, and others have praised work. And in fact, the idea of the contemplative life, the life of idling, where you give yourself lots of leisure time and space, versus the active life, where you work very hard and you work long hours and you make things happen. You know, Elon Musk says, you know, no one changed the world on 40 hours a week. Well, I'm going to prove to you that Elon Musk is completely wrong and a very bad role model as well for other people. Just because he's completely insane doesn't mean that he should kind of impose his insecurity on the rest of us. And today is an interesting time to be talking about this because some of you may have read, and we're in the right kind of lefty environment. You might have read that John McDonnell, of the Labour Party, is, you know, clearly influenced by Marx, and as is Corbyn. Well, there are, in my view anyway, you know, I suppose I love George Orwell. George Orwell rightly pointed out the dangers of totalitarianism in 1984 on Animal Farm. But there's something on the left which is to be praised, which is a promotion of leisure. And John McDonnell today has actually said, you know, we'll be working towards a 32-hour week, i.e. a 4-day week, or something like that. And he said, you know, we work to live, we don't live to work. And leisure is a very important part of the Labour Party's manifesto. This is wonderful to hear because they haven't been talking like this for many, many years. In fact, in my lifetime, both political parties have been extremely pro-hard work. Cameron had the phrase hard-working families. So there's this idea that the entire family has to be working hard. Granny has to be sort of, you know, shoveling the snow, and the little babies are inside doing the washing up. If you don't work hard, then you don't get the benefits of society. That's the Tory line. And when Tories hear about things like 4-day week or other ideas like the citizen's income, which is you know, the idea where you get a certain sum each week as a replacement for the universal credit system or whatever it's called, you know, like a kind of automatic dole, whatever it might be, 20 quid, 50 quid a week. And they say, oh, that's a terrible idea because everyone will just sit at home watching daytime TV and drinking. Or one Tory MP called Nick Bowles said, that's a terrible idea because everyone will just sit around writing poetry and tending their garden, like they're supposed to be bad things. So the Idler was conceived as a way of, as a magazine which would promote idleness and defend leisure for all the good things about it, and attack the Puritan, the Protestant work ethic, and try and discover where all these things come from. So over the last 25 years or so, I've continued to produce the magazine more or less regularly. and I've written a book called How to Be Idle and How to Be Free, which looks into these issues. More recently, I've been studying and reading the ancient philosophers, and so I'm now preparing to sort of construct a history of idling from about 500 BC to the present day. And tonight we're going to start in around 500 BC, and we're going to look at these men, mainly men, not all men, the philosophers, the people who invented the idea of philosophy and what their ideas were and the influence they had on other people. It's also a way of thinking about our own lives, and as you'll see, am I a stoic? Am I an Epicurean? Am I a cynic? Am I a skeptic? You know, what's my attitude to life, and how do I want to live? Well, these are the questions that the ancient philosophers asked themselves. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Daoists, because this is an amazing movement as well. There was roughly the same time in ancient Athens and also in ancient China, the idea of philosophy sort of grew up. So the Daoists and the Confucianists, whatever you call them, the people who lived by Confucius, had very different attitudes to the world. And you can still see these attitudes reflected in modern China. Very briefly, because we're going to focus mainly on the ancient Greeks, the Confucius was trying to construct a system of harmony whereby people behaved very well to each other. You would be very sort of polite. You would kowtow, as it was called. You know, you would do your duty for the state and work for the state, and be the prefect and so on and so forth, and live what we would consider to be sort of a very sort of conventional life. It's the conventions that sort of keep society together. The Taoists had the completely opposite idea, that all this convention is a load of nonsense. The Taoists tend to be sort of men who'd perhaps got past the stage of a family life where the children now left home, and they became sort of wild and free. In India today, it's called going sadhu. So your children have left home, and you give all your money away, and you go wandering around being crazy from town to town with a begging bowl. And these people are very much venerated. The Taoists, the famous one was called Lao Tzu. No one knows whether this was a real person or just a name of a conglomeration of people. And he said things like, go with the flow. There was the story of the Taoist butcher, and the Taoist butcher could carve up the meat with virtually no effort, because instead of just carving through it and using muscle power, he would detect the path of least resistance in the meat. There were little bits where it was actually easier to cut, and so by doing that, he would cut it much more easily. But of course, to be a Taoist butcher, a lazy butcher, you need a lot of practice before. So you can't suddenly be a Taoist butcher on day one. But they're very pro-laziness, and they would write poetry. I sit by my cottage in the Chungyan foothills by this stream. All day long, I do nothing. That's not the exact poem, but that's the kind of poem they would write, and then go and have a long rest. There was sort of the idea of the sort of wispy-bearded sage, who would tell people, don't rush around. Things will happen. There's a plan. And this is the point about Daoism. It means the way. There's some sort of way that's been predestined for you, a bit like a river. So the metaphor of the river was a real favourite with the Taoists. The spring going down to the sea. So there's a spring in the mountains, and this water has to get down to the sea. And in doing that, it takes the path of least resistance, the easiest path through the rocks. It doesn't get machines and plough a straight line down to the sea. It takes the path of least resistance. And in doing that, creates the most beautiful and unique curve. So that could be some kind of a metaphor for one's own life. Don't do the thing that's unnatural to you. Find the thing that, find your own flow. I mean, these are familiar words now from hippies, and even in Silicon Valley, people use the word flow as a sort of a trick where you can sort of concentrate and make more money. That's not what it was meant for originally. It was like, this is my life. This is through this flow, I'm going to get some sort of connection with something outside of me. That's a very sort of brief description of Daoism versus Confucianism. What's amazing is that around the same time, in a sort of outwardly more sophisticated, perhaps, society, ancient Athens, something new was being invented, and it was called philosophy. Now, we sort of think philosophy's been around forever. It wasn't. It was a neologism at the time, and people think it was invented by Socrates. It means, obviously, phil, love, and sophos, meaning wisdom. Now, the real point about this, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more deeply in a future session when we're going to talk about just one book for the whole evening, which is Plato's Symposium, and that's really where philosophy was invented. So I'll just give a brief summary now. The Symposium, which we're trying to kind of recreate here, although this is a little bit more austere than the Symposium of Plato. In the Symposium of Plato, a bunch of blokes lie on couches. It's in the middle of a literary festival. One of them just won the first prize for a great poem. Aristophanes, the famous comic playwright, has also put his play in for the festival. These festivals have like 20, 30, 40,000 people watching. They're absolutely massive. So this is a group of sort of bohemian but sort of quite posh Athenians, and they all love Socrates. And Socrates, at this symposium, tells a story about love. They all have to give a speech about love. And in Socrates' one, he talks about how philosophy, for him, he said love is a sort of a lack. It's something that you don't have, you sort of move towards it. Now, he said, so for him, philosophy is a statement of me not knowing anything. And this is a famous thing about Socrates. He says, I know nothing. He said, wander around ancient Athens, and he compared himself to the Sophists. He was a philosopher. He's moving towards wisdom. He doesn't have wisdom, but he enjoys the journey towards it. He's a philosopher, and he has a long, scraggly beard. He wears simple clothes. He's an anti-consumerist. He goes into the marketplace and he says, who knew how many things there were that I didn't need? He lives almost without money. This isn't to say that he's not in the world. He's married possibly twice, first to Myrto and then to Xanthippe. Myrto, I think, dies. Scholars argue about these points, but this seems to be a rough consensus. So he had 2 children with Myrto, and then married to a much younger wife called Xanthippe, who was well known for being a bit of a pain and being sort of naggy and shrewish, and partly because he didn't earn any money. It reminds me a bit of William Blake. There's a Blake exhibition at the moment. William Blake would come home for dinner, and he wasn't very money orientated, and so his wife would put an empty plate in front of him. And Xanthippe was a bit like that. And the other point to remember is that all these Athenian men, they were very there was a strong kind of homosexual element to the whole thing, but you wouldn't call it homosexual now, because in those days it was much more of a sort of continuum. It was really very common for men to fancy younger boys, and in this case Socrates was massively in love, or reputed to be in love, or certainly massively fancy Alcibiades, who was the sort of young David Beckham of the time, incredibly handsome. He was like a sort of playboy politician. And Socrates and Alcibiades had fought together in one of the wars, the Peloponnesian War. And in fact, Socrates had saved his life. So they had a very sort of close bond. So these men would be lying around on couches. The dancing girls would come in and leave, and the flute players, and then the wine would come in, and they'd drink. And often in the symposium, they're hungover from the night before. But they still ended up drinking. In fact, Socrates drinks all night. He doesn't appear to be drunk, and he goes about his business the next day. So this was like, the point I'm trying to make is it was a fun environment for philosophy. It wasn't sort of A.C. Grayling being puritanical and sort of, I know everything. So this was, and the philosophers compared themselves to the Sophists. Now, the Sophists charged for their teaching, and they said, we have the wisdom. Socrates was good friends with some of these Sophists. They would come into Athens, and they were a bit like Jordan Peterson in that they would be saying to young men, give me money and I'll teach you how to have a successful life. I'll teach you how to sort of behave, what the sort of tricks are if you're a young lawyer and you're like in your 20s or you're a teenager. So he would gather all these people around him, the Sophists, and charge for their teaching. And they became very rich. So there were the Sophists, came before the philosophers. Now, of course, this idea of Sophism is sort of completely forgotten. So philosophy is a sort of a love of wisdom, a moving towards wisdom, and it springs from Socrates. You probably know that when Socrates was about 70, he was put on trial by the Athenian state, and the Athenian state was quite small, 100,000 people, sometimes a democracy, sometimes an oligarchy, but more or less, the whole city felt involved in the government of it, even the slaves and the women who weren't given a vote. It was like being in this sort of Florence, if you can imagine that, a sort of medieval city-state where you're sort of part of it all. Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the morals of the youth and for worshipping false gods and was put to death. And he drank the hemlock, which paralysed him from the feet upwards, and died. His friends tried to rescue him. They could have rescued him, but he said, "No, I'd rather just die." And he said, everyone knew that he was a really annoying person to be around. He was constantly asking questions. He was called the gadfly. And they said, "Well, do you have anything to say in your defence?" He said, "Well, you shouldn't kill me. I've given so much to Athens, the state, as a gadfly, puncturing people's superstitions and the silly things they think. You should be giving me a pension to live on." And that made them even angrier, the jury. And then he was put to death. So there's Socrates in the middle. What are the key elements of his philosophy? Well, he's constantly asking questions. He says he knows nothing. He's sort of anti-consumerist. He's anti-money. He doesn't think that hard work and money and glory will lead to happiness. He's trying to investigate what is meant by the good life. How do you live? And leisure is a really important part of this. Now, as far as idling goes, Socrates in his life does, certainly in the second half of his life, does pretty much nothing. He doesn't even bother to write anything down. He doesn't really work because he's not charging for his teaching. He just literally wanders around chatting. That's what he does. And somehow he becomes one of the most famous people who ever lived. He wore very simple clothes and had a big beard. He was ugly, and people said he was ugly on the outside and beautiful on the inside. He had a sort of pug nose. There was even some suggestion that he had hypothyroidism, which is a condition associated with excessive sexual activity, and which makes your eyes bulge. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. So some scholars are now thinking that he was actually quite a sort of randy shagger, and whether it was with boys or with women or what, we don't exactly know. In his early life, as I mentioned, he'd been quite a distinguished soldier, but in the second half of his life, he basically did nothing. So this is one of the first sort of real idlers of history. I mentioned also Lao Tzu, who may not even have written the book that has his name in it. But somehow these people have this enormous influence, not only on the people who they meet in the everyday, who are all blown away by them. And they all want to, at the symposium, at Plato's symposium, they want to sit next to Socrates, It's not fair you're sitting next to Socrates. He was really eccentric, had this strange habit of going into a trance and just standing in one place, sort of just thinking about something. And he could do this for hours. He apparently did it on the battlefield for hours and hours. When he was invited to go to a dinner party, people would meet him and say, are you off to Agathon's? Yes, I'm off to Agathon's. OK, let's go together. And then he'd turn around and he'd disappeared because he was sort of gazing at something or gone into one of his trances. And apparently he'd had this kind of trance thing from when he was a child, and he heard voices that spoke to him. So this was the person who invented philosophy. And not only invented philosophy, but invented at least 6 schools of philosophy quite soon after he died. Now, he taught Plato. Plato started something called the Academy, which was a philosophical school where you could retreat from Athens, just on the edge of Athens, like this, and go and talk about ideas in a group. Women and slaves also went, as well as the Athenian citizens. Plato taught Aristotle, who started another school called the Lyceum. And Socrates also gave birth to a whole host of other philosophical movements, ideas, or what are called schools. So this word school, by the way, we talk about a philosophical school, and that was the Greek word skole. And the Greek word skole turned into the Latin word scolas, meaning, which meant school, and obviously our word for school. But to us, school is something that you go to, you're sort of forced to. It's not voluntary. But in fact, the word means leisure. So this is why it's so important for the history of idling. The Greek philosophers were saying, take time out. Leisure is the most important part of life. And in fact, Socrates said this, leisure is the greatest gift. So people get themselves in a fuss and take away their own leisure by stressing themselves out about money earning or getting glory, in politics. The greatest gift, the most wonderful possession, is actually free time and leisure. And that's what we should be working to create. Aristotle said, we can't all be like Socrates and, sort of wander around in rags and barefoot and live on nothing, and he was a special person. But we can all work to create the leisure time, but it's in the leisure time that we really become ourselves, and we give ourselves that time to think and to become philosophers and to be creative and to be artists and so on and so forth. Now let's look at some of these schools that came out of Socrates. We'll start with the Stoics. So the Stoics were influenced by Socrates, but they went up in a slightly different direction, and they were kind of like pre-Christians. Remember, this is a pagan society. There were lots of different beliefs. This is something that people forget about, the past. There were lots of different competing beliefs. There were atheists. There were people who believed in one god. There were people who believed in many gods. There were people who believed in all the kind of superstitions of the time. There were these strange things called herms in houses, which were like a statue of a man, and then a big blank thing, and then a sort of erect phallus, which people thought was a good idea. I don't really know why, to have around in your house. Later, people knocked off the faces and the phalluses in some kind of anti-religious uprising. There were these other strange priestesses who lived in a temple and were supposed to inhale strange vapors that made them talk in riddles. These riddles were called the oracles, and they would say things like, "No one is wiser than Socrates." And some of these women were sort of semi-prostitutes or something like that, in a way that scholars don't quite understand, I don't think. So it's quite a strange society with all this stuff going on, rituals, but also very sophisticated. When you read the plays and the Plato's dialogues, which are really quite readable, actually, because they're basically like little plays and they're quite short. It's fun. It's a fun society and very, very sophisticated. There were astronomers and astrologers. So the Stoics, their idea was we all know what Stoic means on a kind of surface level. It's something like putting up with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, like sort of stiff upper lip. But it's often interpreted as like keeping your emotions inside you, and maybe that was something that was wrong if you're sort of too stoic. There's a little bit more to it than that. I mean, there's obviously a lot of truth in that. And today it's turned into something called cognitive behavioural therapy. So the Stoics is all about, the famous books are things like The Manual by Epicurus, who was a Roman slave who came a bit later. And Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, was also a great Stoic philosopher. And these books, you can read them now in Penguin translations, and they really are nice to have by the bed. It's quite a harsh philosophy. Its essence, I suppose, is, look around you. Why are you anxious? The philosophers were trying to rid people of the anxiety they had in ancient Athens, just as we're anxious now about the political situation, whatever it might be. What's the source of this anxiety? And how can we help people to overcome it? And to become, basically, happy, and to live the good life. And the good life, or happiness, was translated as we translate their word as into the good life. Their original word for happiness or good life was eudaimonia, eudaimonia, and that's something like all at one with your demon, your sort of spirit. Now, this is what Stoicism was all about. So they said, look at the things around you, and people waste a lot of energy trying to change other people's actions and worrying about things they can't change, possibly, ever, and don't do anything like enough changing themselves because the one thing that they can change. So this was the sort of essence of Stoic philosophy. But there's a little bit more to it than that. So, Stoic philosophers would walk down the street. Everyone knew in the small, relatively small ancient Athens knew there were Stoic philosophers. So the little boys would throw stones at them to try and make them go, swear or lose their composure. And the Stoic philosopher would turn around and say, thank you for giving me the chance to test my stoicism, young boy. And so they were slightly annoying in a way. But why were they Stoic? Well, today, CBT says, you can change your reactions. This is the whole idea, So you start with a small thing that annoys you, and, you train your inner core to not react, to sort of take it with equanimity. And then you can build up to bigger things. And the Stoics say, my wife died, my leg was cut off, I'm ill, my son died, and I don't let it affect me. But why? So there's something else going on under it, which is actually quite sort of religious and almost Christian. And they have the phrase, go with the flow. That's a Stoic phrase, go with the flow. And again, a bit like the Taoists, there's a flow out there, there's some kind of predetermined path for you, and you need to sort of lock into it. When something goes wrong, that's meant to be, so you're learning a lesson from that. And we all know that to be true. We have terrible things go wrong in our lives, but somehow we emerge, and then you learn something, and you look back and you think, well, that's why I went through that. That actually taught me something. So from the small to the big, this is the Stoic attitude. So there's a reason why they maintain a stiff upper lip, because they know underneath everything that there's some kind of flow. And the word logos is associated with them, which is the first word, one of the first words in the Bible. In the beginning was logos. And logos, we say in the beginning was the word. I'm not sure why it's translated as word. It's just a really weird translation. They would translate, it's a Greek word, another translation would be the way, or the path, or something like that. Some people even translate it as the joke. It's like some kind of cosmic joke. So there's this thing, there's a logos, the path. And this is what the Stoics, before Christianity, were kind of talking about. And they started Stoic centres, a bit like Plato's Academy. And Mark Vernon, who writes for the Idler and has taught me a lot of this stuff, says that Plato's Academy and some of the other schools that sprang out of this amazing movement in 400, 500 BC Athens only closed at about 500, 400 AD when the first monasteries opened. So they were like monasteries, these places. And they certainly would have influenced the early Christians, who then sailed around the world starting monasteries. And by the way, we'll come back to this if we've got time, but the early Christians were really not interested at all in work. That sort of came later. In fact, it was seen as sort of almost wrong to work, certainly to work hard. The main point of life for the early Christians was to pray. Certainly you had to live, but you created these wonderful retreats where people could come and pray, and that was the most important thing. And later, the monk, it was frowned upon for monks to work in the very early days. Later, they did work. They did really good work, beer brewing and bread making. And so monks still today obviously are famous for their beer because it was felt that was something creative, and it brought people together and it was good. So God's work was creative. And so if you were to do some work, it should be something creative like making bread or making beer. There were a few, while we're in the Karl Marx Memorial Library, I'll just mention quickly what occurs to me. Karl Marx's son-in-law was called Paul Lafargue, and he wrote an essay called The Right to be Lazy, Le Droit à la Paresse, after Marx in the 1890s, I think. And it's a satirical pamphlet, but he says, why does everyone hurl themselves at the factory gates when jobs are mentioned? What is this thing that's sort of impelling us to work? In the old days, work was seen as something base that only slaves did. And we should all be aiming much higher towards a level where we don't work. And this was sort of Lafargue's much less, far less industrious scholar than Marx himself. So, and Lafargue makes this sort of quite good joke. God gives the best example to us all, because he works for 6 days and then rests for the whole of eternity. So that's the kind of like just a little burst of work, and then many lifetimes off. That should be what we're aiming towards. So that's the Stoics. So they go with the flow. The next best known probably is the Epicureans. The Epicureans was another school that sprang out of this sort of love for Socrates. These are all different interpretations of what Socrates had said, and for the Epicureans, which was started by a guy called Epicurus, life was about friendship, and if you wanted to take away that anxiety of living in the city, then you should move out of the city. Anxiety was also caused by sort of competition with other people, so you should live in a sort of a hippie commune. And this is what Epicurus did. So he founded his movement. He bought a house for something like 10,000 silver coins, which I don't know how he got those, but he did. Again, outside the centre of Athens. And he called it the Garden. And over the entrance of the garden was inscribed a legend along the lines of, "Here the highest good is pleasure." So Epicurus said, you're anxious because you believe all this nonsense, this superstitious nonsense. You make sacrifices, you pray to these gods. Look, there's nothing really there. You don't have to worry about elves in the woodland and so on. And there are rational explanations for lightning and so on. It's not a curse, And his central belief was in atomism, that the world is made of atoms. And he'd got this from another philosopher called Democritus. So he was essentially a materialist. Now, we're in the Marx library. Marx was hugely inspired by Epicurus, All this stuff about God is not... He was almost atheist, Epicurus, but not quite, because he did believe in some kind of higher power. And Marx loved Epicurus and Democritus. The world is just a meaningless kind of collision of atoms. They swerve into each other, they bang around, We've got to make our own life in this world, in this material world. Religion is the opium of the people. Well, religion is the opium of the people could have almost been said by Epicurus. It's the kind of thing that he said. He also said, death is nothing to us. He was very practical about money, because he said, you don't actually need that much to be comfortable. The sort of bare necessities, if you like, of life are sort of actually reasonably easy to get for most people. Not everybody, but for most people. People work hard to get the things that are unnecessary. I mean, you could think about personalised number plates, for example. What a pointless, vain trifle. And people work really, really hard so they can get a personalised number plate. So what? Or even cards, You can get a Vauxhall for £1,000, or you can work incredibly hard and stress yourself out, sack people, be really brutal, be a kind of brutal neoliberal, make loads of money, and buy yourself a Rolls Royce for £100,000. What's the difference? Barely anything. So he said, anxiety, when you know that you don't need that much, anxiety sort of is lessened. And this is one of his sort of 4 points. The Greeks feared death, as Christians did later. He said, death is nothing to us, we just kind of crumble into ashes. And he said the most important part of life is your friends, and cultivate your friendship, philoi. So that's what he did in his Epicurean commune. In the Epicurean commune, slaves, women, courtesans all lived there together. Courtesans were a big feature of Athenian society, sort of semi-prostitutes. But everyone was welcome in this, in the garden, and they ate together, they drank together. They kept their cost low by growing their own vegetables. And this sort of thing. So it was like it was a commune. It was like a Gandhi type setup. And again, this movement, the garden movement, lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. Gardens sprung up all across the Mediterranean, and the influence of Epicurus and still today is massive. We get Epicurean slightly wrong because we think it means luxury loving, and that's because he really was a pleasure lover. But it was a little more subtle than that. It wasn't about self-indulgence. So, he said sex, drugs, and rock and roll, okay, fine, but, you can't keep doing that. It's going to affect your health. And so I think the example is lamb. For some reason, he used lamb as an example of a very rich food. I might like to eat all this lamb now, but actually it's going to make me feel sick and kind of like indigestive later. And he said, I'm actually perfectly happy with a barley cake and a glass of water. So they were quite frugal, the Epicureans. And he said they didn't. So when they said we're pleasure loving, it was about the avoidance of pain. It wasn't about sort of luxury loving. However, they said if luxury comes along, great, embrace it. You know, like have a great meal. Don't be sort of too ascetic about it. But if you know how to live on small amounts of money, that makes you feel very secure because you're not afraid of poverty. So that was one of his ideas, to sort of take away the fear of poverty, the anxiety of being poor, which is clearly something that motivates us to perhaps work or at least overwork. To close, we will look at the cynics and the skeptics, and briefly the peripatetics. Now, the skeptics, they took Socrates' idea of I don't know anything, and the fact that he asked people lots of questions, to create a philosophy around asking questions. And that's what skeptic means, I don't know anything. Climate change is skeptic. I'm going to ask questions. Maybe that's not a good example, but I'm going to ask questions about climate change. It's also I see the skeptical spirit in something like QI, the TV show, because everything's endlessly interesting, and you're always asking questions, even if it's about something apparently quite boring like Basingstoke. But you go into the world with this kind of spirit of curiosity, not smugness. I know everything. But the skeptics, I think Pierrot was the famous skeptic, they got themselves in slight muddles because he would say, well, what's a skeptic? It means I don't know anything. How can you know that you don't know anything? And so this would like tie them up into these little sort of philosophical knots. And for that reason, I sort of retreated from it slightly. But Plato's Academy would often be run by a skeptical philosopher. After Plato died, various others, took over. And they would argue about all these sorts of ideas. Probably the most sort of sexy in a way, the most kind of outrageous of the Greek philosophers, who were quite outrageous in the first place because they were saying, don't run around, don't scurry around overworking and get yourself in fretting about money and stuff. And Socrates had, as I said, went around in rags almost. The monk's garb is clearly influenced by these ancient Greek philosophers. Just a very simple kind of sack with a piece of string around your waist, in order to demonstrate that you have no need for vain things and riches and the trifles and so on. But the cynics took a bit of Socrates and took it to an extreme. The most well-known was Diogenes. Diogenes famously lived in a barrel. Well, it was a sort of upturned wine cask, like a sort of huge wine cask like that with a hole in the middle. And he put this on in the shadow of the temple and climbed inside it. And he said, that's all I need to live in. I mean, I don't know why you're also rushing around with these ridiculous houses. And dogs would come and lie around him. He was unshaven, dirty, filthy, a bit like a tramp. His clothes were ripped and torn. He would go gatecrash parties, piss on the floor, steal the wine, and have sex in public, masturbate in public. He would basically overturn convention wherever he found it. His father was some kind of coin, minted coins, and the cynical maxim was something like deface the coinage. We're going to deface the coinage. And that there was a pun in ancient Greek. It also meant something like subvert custom. So he went around saying, all this custom is nonsense. Plato's Academy, you're all talking crap. Plato's Academy said, what is man? Man is a featherless biped. And they said, yes, man is a featherless biped. That's a good one. Let's write that down. And then Diogenes would run in half naked and throw a plucked chicken into the middle and say, here is your man. And he was against book reading or study or anything. Get out in nature, a bit like the Daoists. Don't sort of trouble your brain with this kind of academic philosophizing. It's all silly. There were loads of anecdotes about him. He was going for a walk in the woods with his one possession, which was a kind of a rudely carved wooden bowl. And which he used for his sort of food and drink. And he saw a peasant boy walking down to the stream, and the peasant boy kneeled down by the stream and cupped his hands and drank some water from the stream like this, whereupon Diogenes looked at his wooden bowl and said, "What an absurd encumbrance," and threw it into the forest. So he sort of had nothing. So that was the anti-consumerist part of Socrates, which was taken to a real extreme. The asceticism, the total rejection of any sort of custom. There were other cynics. The famous cynic couple were Hipparchia and Crates. Crates was a cynic philosopher. He sort of wandered around shouting at people. You know, they knew who the rich people were. They would spit at them, and they were very, very punkish. So the 1970s, you know, the Johnny Rottens, the punks in King's Road, they dressed not for work. You wouldn't be employed dressed like that. They would drink all day, gate crash parties, steal booze, spit at the rich people, and so on. These are all classic behaviours of the cynical philosopher. By the way, what does cynical mean in Greek? Well, cynikos meant dog, because they were nicknamed the dog philosophers because they lived like dogs. So we get the word canine, I guess, from that. So cynical, it doesn't really mean what it means to us now, which is, you know, sort of negative. It literally means dog-like, living like a dog, because the dogs had no clothes, they had sex in public, they had no possessions. You know, Imagined by John Lennon is another classic statement of cynical philosophy. Imagine no possessions. Imagine no heaven is Epicurean philosophy. So these ideas keep coming back again and again into the culture. Crates and Hipparchia are a lovely example, because Crates was this sort of quite grotty old man. Hipparchia was a beautiful young girl who was probably sort of 16 or 18 from an aristocratic family. Her parents, naturally enough, wanted her to get married to a sort of handsome young rich man. And she had plenty of suitors, they would come around, but she rejected them all because she was in love with Crates, with this sort of tramp. And her parents were absolutely appalled. So Crates went round to her house, and he also tried to dissuade her. And he took all his clothes off and says, "Here I am, this is all I have." And she said, "That's all I want." And they got married, and he said, "You're going to have to live like this." And he said, I do want to live like a cynical philosopher. They would still go out to evening parties, dinner parties, symposiums. Usually, the custom was that women weren't allowed to go to the symposiums, or they certainly didn't normally go. And Hipparchia said, "That's all nonsense. I'm going to go out together with Hipparchia to the dinner party." So she was kind of subverting custom. And she became a very well-known philosopher herself. And she's also written about in Diogenes Laertius's, not the cynical philosopher Diogenes, and not a later writer, wrote a book about all these philosophers, and she's among those. So the cynical philosophers are, you know, and then later there's Renaissance paintings of cynical philosophers. Again, they're unshaven, they have ripped clothes. These ideas were picked up by the situationist philosophers in the 1950s in Paris, and they scrawled things like "Ne travaillez jamais," never ever work. That was one of their graffitis. And they then influenced Malcolm McLaren and punk. So this kind of anti-work, and of course the cynical philosophers didn't do any sort of work, but they became very famous and loved for doing this. Not that everyone should become a cynical philosopher, but it's good to have them there to keep reminding you of the vanity of human wishes and desires and riches and so on. And Alexander the Great, Diogenes' fame spread. Alexander the Great thought he was amazing. Alexander the Great came to visit him in his upturned wine cask, where he's kind of sitting there dressed in rags in the shadow of the temple with dogs sitting around. And he goes up to him and says, "Great Diogenes, wonderful philosopher, I've come to see you. Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes said, "Yes, would you mind standing out of my light?" So he wouldn't sort of kowtow to anybody, even Alexander the Great. Most philosophers would sort of hang around at the gates of rich men because they didn't have money. Socrates apparently had a couple of properties, so he rented them out, and that's how he could sort of just about keep going. This is all sort of guesswork. But generally, philosophers were hanging around trying to get money from the rich men. But Diogenes was like, "No, I'm not going to do that." So his life itself demonstrated the the fact that perhaps we put too much store in these material things. I'll just wind up with the Peripatetics. Now, Aristotle became probably the best known philosopher, certainly in the medieval period. Peripatetics means he wandered around. But he was very reasonable. He wrote lots of books, and he said that, we have to work, but we need some leisure. We need to earn some money, but not too much, and you need to be sort of courageous, but not foolhardy. It was all about moderation. So that's a little snapshot of this really wonderful period of only 100 years in ancient Greece. It starts with Socrates and goes on to give birth to all these philosophical schools, and possibly has an influence on our final idler of this session. And next session, we're going to talk about the last 1,000 years. But if we go up to the figure of Christ, he's very much Socrates-like character. I mean, he's certainly obviously less earthy. Socrates is supposed to be like fun-loving. He drinks all night. He's into sex and so on. But there are lots of elements in Christ's behaviour and the things he says that are in common with these crazy Greek philosophers. His simple dress, for example, the fact that he doesn't have a job, he doesn't work, he's not interested in working, he subverts convention, he turns over the tables of the money changers, he's saying it's easier for a rich man to get into the eye of heaven, and all these sorts of ideas. These are all very much kind of cynical, stoic kind of ancient Greek philosophical notions, which are being put into a new context, which comes out of the old ways. And I'll just finish. As Christ is saying, don't worry about money. It's one of his main one of his main messages. And he says, consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. Yet I say to you that Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed as one of these. So that's a classic kind of, it's like Socratesian or Diogenes type thing to say. And he also goes on to say in the Sermon on the Mount, which is a lovely pro-idling text, do the birds worry about their raiment and where they're going to get? No, it's a God will provide sort of thing. There's some sort of flow there. If you just take the time to discover it. Thank you very much.